right, hey guys, welcome to the penultimate lecture, right? One more to go after this, and then you're finally done, or at least we're getting to the final exam. This week we're going to give coverage to the Civil War, probably the most disastrous war in terms of body count, social transformation, and kind of general shakeup of the United States. Throughout American history, especially in our period, but it's even comparable to the kind of shakeups that happened in the 20th century with the two world wars. But this time, right, we're going to talk about not only the political and social changes going on, right? The United States is never the same after this. American society is never the same after this. The war results in the abolition of slavery. It sees a massive casualty, right, from both sides, North and South. There's approximately 1.6 million dead, and that's not counting wounded or people who suffered capture and the prison camps, which were extremely deadly, right? Overall, the United States is not the same country after it, and so in that way, the Civil War can be considered, in some of its political, cultural, social, and even economic aspects, a second revolution, right? What does it mean to be the United States? What is America even about, right? What are the promises of 76, and do they find fulfillment? And of course, as most things are, the answer is both yes and no, but we're going to get into that. All right, so before we get into the real guts of the conflict, I want to go over real quick the basics and rudiments of the government of this new southern nation. So after South Carolina secedes, and so along with all the other southern states, they hold, just like the United States does after the American Revolution, they hold a constitutional convention, and they adopt a legal standard by which the new government is founded. And so this new government, which we call in short the Confederacy, or the CSA, which stands for the full name, Confederate States of America, this new government was founded in a manner pretty similar to the United States, but with a few key differences. One of them was the office of the presidency was limited to a single 6-year term. Now, the importance of this was in the fact that even though no president had ever acquired more than 2 terms in the United States, this fact was due mostly to custom. Remember, George Washington never accepted more than 2 terms, and George Washington was viewed as the model president, right? Everything from putting your hand on a Bible and swearing an oath, right? That all comes from Washington. There's no rules or laws about how someone's supposed to be sworn into the oath of, to swear in the oath of office, or how you're supposed to do it. But Washington kind of set the standard. However, Southern politicians feared that the office of the executive could become too imbalanced and too powerful, and so they wanted to lock it in for a single term. Now, you could kind of be of two minds of this. On the one hand, you could argue, well, if the people want someone, and that person is sort of a key ally in defense of the institutions of democracy, why should a law prohibit that? And so you see that in the case of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who's president elected in 1930s and 40s, and he goes on to actually win 4 terms to the presidency. Now, after that, he dies in office in the 1940s. There's a law finally passed that says, okay, well, you can only be elected to 2 terms. But, right, if the people want it, why not allow it? Of course, on the other hand, you could say that allowing someone to be executive potentially indefinitely could be a sure sign of tyranny, right? What if somebody goes into the White House and they use all of the resources of government to keep themselves in the White House? Any kind of political strategist will tell you that an incumbent or somebody who's already in office has an advantage over someone running against him. So this seems to privilege the person who can win the first time. He could, in theory, kind of stay in there forever, right? So, you could be there's multiple perspectives on that issue. Another key part about the Confederate Constitution is its lip service paid to states' rights. Remember, in theory, the ideology was that the federal government of the North was now going to encroach and steal the rights of the poor southern states who were battling against a tyrant and a behemoth, right? But this, in fact, actually turns out to be something kind of as a phantom. It's total bullshit when it comes to actually applying it in the case of volunteer soldiers. In the Confederate Constitution, it says explicitly that the Confederacy cannot form its own army. It requires volunteers that each state is supposed to contribute and give to the central government. But in reality, conscriptions happen when manpower starts to diminish, when Southern patriots start to turn against the war, saying, right, this is a disaster, it's killing us, it's killing our economy, it's destroying our life, it's destroying our friends' lives, it's just ruining our towns and cities, right? The Confederacy steams along, and they start to implement all sorts of restrictions on people's lives, from requisitioning their property to conscripting people into service, and eventually even implementing bread lines and food limits. Of course, right, the one piece of property that was almost never touched was slave ownership, especially for large slave owners, and we're going to come back to that. These people, what we could call the elite or the oligarchs of Southern society, they remain in the driver's seat to the very end. And then, of course, as you might expect, slavery is absolutely guaranteed as a right in the new Southern government. Now, the first Southern government was made up of, if you're a Confederate or a Civil War nerd, you'll know that the president of the Confederacy was a man named Jefferson Davis, who was from Mississippi and was a former United States senator. And his vice president was from Georgia, a man named Alexander Stephens. Now, in the last lecture, I mentioned that the fire breathers, or these kind of radical secessionists, that their movement was something of a sham, right? They were the sort of popular engine to get people involved, to get people to vote on these state measures, right? Should we leave the Union, yes or no? Should we join the Confederacy, yes or no? These people tended to reflect what I've been calling sort of the Southern American dream, right? The idea that everyone will get their small plot of land, they'll be able to grow crops for themselves, they'll be able to raise a family, they'll be able to be free from all debt and from all sort of external coercion. And part of that dream is about the idea of acquiring 1, 2, maybe 3 slaves, right? And of course, that ideology is bulwarked with the idea of paternalism, which is that, well, the Negro's too stupid and childlike to take care of himself. He'll just drive himself into poverty, alcoholism, eventually death. He needs kind of firm instruction from a fatherly figure. And so, this is all part of a kind of good life. But these people, these kind of the more radical wing of the Democratic Party in the South, they are never in any substantial power. The real people who are in power are former Whigs. Jefferson Davis was a former Whig. Alexander Stephens was a former Whig. The Secretary of State of the Confederacy was a wealthy lawyer, politician named Judah P. Benjamin. And so the Confederate government tended to represent the interests of these elite slaveholders. And so I'm not talking about the guy who's aspiring to buy a slave one day so he can be economically independent. I'm not talking about the small farmer who grows a little cotton on the side. Right? No, I'm talking about the small clique of elites who tended to live in kind of major cities or on plantations linked to the economy of major cities, who owned vast tracts of land and employed hundreds, if not thousands, of slaves. I shouldn't say employed. I meant, keep people in bondage, held against their will, and, vociferously tortured and beaten and oppressed into engaging in kind of increasing cotton output, right? This small clique of elites runs the Confederate government, and when average Confederates, average Southerners who were maybe patriots, who believed in the Southern cause of freedom and the idea of economic independence, and right, remember that people were talking about how horrible northern cities were, about this influx of immigration, about how living standards was rapidly declining as industrial output was rapidly booming. Right, they didn't want to live in the North. They thought it was a disaster. They liked the idea of having their small little farm. The agrarian idea of Jefferson is something that they held to. But the Confederacy never was run that way. And then on top of it, the capital of the Confederacy was moved very early on to Richmond, Virginia, which was part of a deal to kind of get Virginia to sort of jump. If you remember from us talking before, Virginia was never a cotton empire state. Virginia, like other middling or upper South states like North Carolina, Tennessee, Kentucky, they did not engage. They had slaves, but they never engaged in slave kind of cotton output. So, offering Richmond kind of got as the capital, got Virginia to jump ship and side with the Confederacy, even though their interests aren't perfectly aligned. Though having Richmond gave the South access to what was formerly a federal armory. So Harper's Ferry is scrapped. Remember, that's where John Brown attacked. Harper's Ferry scrapped and moved to Richmond. Richmond was a booming industrial town, not comparable to Boston or to New York, but it was the South, sort of one of the South's biggest port cities and manufacturers. So Richmond becomes a key element in the Southern strategy. And finally, just as one other point of interest, this flag I'm circling, this is actually the Confederate national flag. That's the same as sort of how the stars and stripes are for the United States. This bottom one that I'm pointing an arrow to, that's the Confederate naval jack. So, when you think of the Confederate flag, usually you think to the bottom one, but it's actually the first one on top that's the Confederate flag. So that's your trivia for the week. And so here are just an outline of what these leaders actually look like. So here's Jefferson Davis on the left. In the middle is Alexander Stephens, who kind of looks like Dennis the Menace to me. It looks like he's 12, even though in this portrait he's clearly a man in his 40s or 50s. And then a key figure, which we're going to mention a lot more, is Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee was a Virginian. He was the man who cracked down and captured John Brown. But more essentially, he becomes the general, the official figure for the Confederate war effort. And some historians have argued, right, even though the Union will win, even though the Union basically has more or better everything than the South, there's an argument to be made that the South had the brains. They had the best generals, and so this is what allows the South to, unexpectedly to some in the North, win battle after battle and really seem to threaten the viability of a continued war. Now, a key element for understanding why the Civil War turns out the way that it does, why it's so horrific, why the body count is so huge, has to do with the new technologies introduced. So a key element is that the guns are different. In the 19th century, a technique known as rifling takes place. So before, when you'd fire a musket, which is a kind of more primitive form of gun, the barrels that you shot the ball out of were smooth. When you rifle it, that's creating some grooves in the inside of the barrel. I can't tell you the exact physics of it, but it improves the accuracy by putting a spin on the ball when it's fired out of the gun. So rifling heavily improves accuracy. In prior conflicts, right, and I drew an illustration on how fights took place in the Revolutionary War. You'd have two sides, right? They'd line up and then they'd fire at each other, and then the other team would, or the other army would fire at each other. And so the idea was basically like a shotgun effect. You just kind of blast at each other, and you don't know what you're shooting at, but with all of these pellets being fired at each other, you're going to wipe out a bunch of people in the army, and you just kept firing at each other until one side decided to run away, and then the winning army could decide either to hunt them down and chase them, or to sort of stand their ground and accept this more nominal victory. But with rifling, you could actually, with a serious degree of accuracy, know what you're shooting at and hit your target. So this increased the amount of casualties, especially because, and this is key, the tactics for a long while are not updated. So armies were still marching, up within, visible distance where you could actually see the person's face, and then they would fire at each other, and the casualties rapidly increased. Additionally, new forms of firearms, the Colt pistol, which could hold 6 bullets, which was an improved over the sort of old style pistol. These Colt pistols had increased accuracy, and you could have kind of more of a rapid fire with them. Additionally, you have the invention of the Gatling gun, which is the first kind of machine gun. So you didn't just fire and then have to reload, you could fire multiple bullets. And so this just increased the massacre and the slaughter on these battlefields. The Gatling gun wasn't used too much, especially when you compare it to World War I, which is sort of comparable in terms of old tactics with new technology, but it was used in some battles to devastating effect. Additionally, we already talked a little bit about the telegraph. The telegraph, before you'd have to run messages back and forth, whether on foot or on horseback, but with the telegraph, you could now have cables that communicated a series of beeps that could then, through a code, through Morse's code, Morse being the inventor of the telegraph, hence Morse code, it could communicate over long distances in a short amount of time. So this increased the actual amount of authority that leadership in Washington and Richmond exercised over the battle. Lincoln and his government and Jefferson Davis and his government could actually communicate with their generals, find out, what happened in a battle from day to day, how a particular front of the war was going, and issue commands. Additionally, and this is key if you ever watch Ken Burns' Civil War documentary, photography was a new invention that allowed people to have a greater sense of experiencing the war. We kind of take it for granted that, you see pictures everywhere, photographs everywhere, but photography now allowed people to see the actual brutality and cost of the war. They could see the battlefield strewn with bodies. Before, all you had were either words, which you'd have to imagine for yourself, or someone would sketch out or paint a picture, right? And of course, sketching and painting, it seems farther away, it seems more unreal and distant, even if it's accurate. But with photography, you had this real visceral sense that there you were standing on the battlefield, and you could see the soldiers lined up. You could see them in their uniforms. You could see their bodies scattered across, missing arms and legs and heads even, right? Blown off from cannonballs or from bullet fire. So this kept the public, both in the South and the North, further abreast of what's going on and kind of helped them either turn them against the war or turn them further for it. Now, I just want to go off on a sidetrack real quick. It's really important to understand as just sort of a modern person living in the world today. A lot of people treat photographs as simple reality, right? Well, it looks real. It's just sort of a snapshot. Somebody just wandered in and took a quick picture, and that's just the real world. That's a direct experience to the real, right? That's just how it is. But of course, this increases the ability for photography to be extremely successful propaganda, right? And the Civil War saw a little bit about this. When they took pictures of the battlefield, the idea, the sort of implicit assumption that a lot of people make is you see the photograph and you think, oh, that's the battlefield, that's what happened. But for maximal effects, photographers would move bodies around on the battlefield. They tell people how to pose. And so, especially with the camera technology back then, it couldn't showcase any movement. You had to actually stand still. Even today, right, and I'm sure, if you think about it, modern news services use photography for devastating effect. Say you want someone to support your war effort in a foreign conflict, right? What better way than to show camera footage or photographs of what's going on the ground, right? But especially in the recent case of Syria, there's been serious skepticism applied, and for due reason, about some of the use of video and photography to sort of stir up war fervor. People would see these photographs of people being bombed and attacked, and a particular kind of mercenary group was recording it, but other footage and other records and other witnesses testify that this group is actually not the people they say they are. So video and photography can be used to sort of manipulate public consciousness, create moral outrage, stir up feelings of panic, fear, mania, sadness, rage, all the real visceral emotions that get people to act, either because they're mad as hell or they're scared and they don't know what to do. It's something worth thinking about, especially in our own crisis right now, living in Corona world, that you have to really weigh the circumstances. You have to actually do a little bit more digging. You can't just take video evidence or photographs as sort of face value revelations of what the world is really like or what's actually happening. And so even though photographs become harder to fake, though technology today you can actually airbrush people in and out of photographs, alter features, and also you can do similar kind of technical manipulations with video footage. But you got to really be critical because it seems so close to real life. All right, so anyway, that's my side ramble. Another key feature of the Civil War were the invention of the application of the invention of steam engine. So naval battles weren't the wooden ships using sails to kind of orient around each other and blast each other with cannon. Now you could use steam engines, so you didn't depend upon currents. Ships could sail up and down rivers. They could sail up and down coastlines in a way that allowed naval blockades to be used to much more devastating effect. And we're going to kind of talk about how the North succeeds in using this. Additionally, railways and railroads in the steam engine on trains become essential for the movement of troops, but also the movement of supplies and goods. So you can get food to your troops. You can move troops to the front a lot quicker, especially if you take heavy casualties, and we'll talk about that. But the steam engine helps shrink the map of war and allows armies to stay more integrated with their supply depots further inland in the civilian section of the battle. So, how does the Civil War unfold? I'm not a major Civil War nerd. I don't know all the battles in rich detail. I know that there are some professors, or maybe you are one of these people. You can tell me day by day, hour by hour, how battles unfold. You know the names of all the generals and various other commanders underneath them and where they're positioned on a map. Maybe you even know someone who's in your family or personal friend or something who even is engaged in sort of Civil War reenactments, or they love everything Civil War. They buy all the books. They can tell you. So if you want to know heavy details, you're not going to get it from these lectures. There's a little bit more in the textbook, but I want to deal with sort of broad strokes. What are the concepts involved, right? What is the significance from one battle to the next? And kind of just covering the major details. All right. So for the North, a key element to their plan was formulated as the Anaconda Plan. This plan was come up by Winfield Scott, who was an ancient at this point, right? Winfield Scott was participating in the war 1812. He's still alive by the Civil War, and so he comes up with this idea. And then he dies shortly after. But Winfield Scott's idea was basically we can really destroy the South. We can squeeze them like an anaconda into submission if we strangle them economically. So the North knew it had a naval advantage, and we're going to talk about this, but the North had an overwhelming industrial output advantage over the South. The North could pump out more guns. The North could pump out more ships. The North could pump out more people. The North had an advantage numerically and technologically in every single way over the South. Like I said, the only advantage the South really has is one, the South is just trying to survive, so its war aims are a lot smaller, and we're going to get to that. But two, the South had the better brains. They had the better generals, the kind of more tactful commanders who actually knew how to kind of advance the Southern cause, at least in terms of the war. But in general, the Anaconda Plan was, right, the best way to hurt the South is we punch them in their wallet. If we strangle their kind of interior trade, so we take over the Mississippi River, we would split the South in half. And then on top of it, if we can blockade all their ports, they're not going to be able to trade with European countries that might want to aid them. And this turns out to be one of the most key northern strategies that allows the North to continue to make mistakes, but never really fall substantially behind in the war effort. All right, so the Union's plan, right, is basically this, right? Let's just go sack the capital. We can take Richmond, right? Richmond is roughly about 3 hours from Washington, D.C., if you're driving today. So it's not that far. If we can march an army through Virginia, we capture Richmond, we capture Jefferson Davis and the entire Confederate government, the southern states will roll up like a carpet, right? What else are they going to do, right? We have their leadership. We can basically hold them hostage. So the North thinks, all right, this war will be basically easy. We have the manpower. We're just going to march down. So the North's major army at this time, which is also known as the Army of the Potomac, its strategy is, okay, we'll just exert this pressure and we'll just stomp our way down. Well, the first time they try to do this, they get caught in a place called, it's a modern city of Manassas, Virginia, and they come up against the Southern Army at the first Battle of Bull Run. At first, it looks like the Union will win, but the Southern Army marshals itself to a devastating counterattack and sends the Union Army into total disarray, right? People break ranks and they start running for their lives. This battle showcases not only the South's key ability, right? They win, which was shocked to the North, but it showed the kind of, it was a premonition for the scale of this new kind of warfare. So in the first Battle of Bull Run, there are 600 dead. And this might not seem like a lot, especially when you think of modern wars, but 600 dead in one battle was the most ever lost in any single battle that the United States had faced up to this point. Right? And this number is going to get dwarfed later on, just obliterated. But 600 dead on both sides. The Confederacy rallies from this victory, and the North now becomes somewhat apprehensive. The Union Army of the Potomac, which is its major force on the East Coast, it's placed off and on in the hands of a guy named George McClellan. His name will pop up again. But the Army of Potomac starts to sort of shift into a more defensive strategy. Keep the pressure on Virginia, but at all costs, make sure that Washington, D.C. does not fall to the Confederacy. And if you know geographically, right, even though the Union is referred to as the North, right, the capital still remains in Washington, D.C. And Washington, D.C. is made up of land that's mixed from Maryland and Virginia, both of which are slave states. One of which is barely in the Union, Maryland, and we're going to come back to that. But the key element was that, look, the army must proceed. It must continue to press upon Richmond by one way or another. And the second Battle of Bull Run is another attempted failure, moving to Manassas and getting squashed by the Confederacy. But the North makes sure we can only move if we know Washington, D.C. is safe. Right? Because otherwise the whole war might be lost if the Republican government of Lincoln gets captured. So here's a picture of kind of graphic form. What does the Anaconda plan look like? And so you think of Anaconda snake wrapping its body around all of these southern ports, squeezing the life out of them until the South submits. So, all right, we have the North. It has clear technological advantage, right? In every way. Factory output dwarfs the South, right? Remember, all the factories are being built in the North, and those factories are producing southern cotton, and then those factories create enough capital, sort of branch out into other industries. Pennsylvania has the sort of major iron industry, so that shows up all the equipment to build railroads, to build guns, to build all sorts of, to build steamships. The North has a huge population advantage. Remember, the reason why Lincoln is able to win without taking a single southern state, in fact, the South didn't even run. In some southern states, they didn't even allow Lincoln to run on their ballot. They blocked all Republicans from being even nominated as a presidential candidate. Part of the reason he was able to do that was the huge disparity. The United States had 22 million people, while the Confederacy had only 9 million people. And of that 9 million, 3.5 million of them were slaves. So, right, that's almost, at least when it comes to the white population, that's over 3 times as many people that the North has over the South. The North was receiving the influx of German and Irish immigrants, and we're going to come back to them, but they make up a huge bulk of those fighting in the army. So they have this huge advantage. But the problem the North has, right, is the North has to win the war. The South just has to survive, right? The Confederacy is not trying to conquer the North. The Confederacy is just trying to fight to a standstill. So this creates a much greater pressure on the North to invade the South and force its rebel government back into the fold. But of course, if you're going to run a military expedition, if you're going to fund armies, right, you're going to need money. How are you going to do that? So Lincoln comes against several struggles. On the one hand, Lincoln's fearful, rightly so, that if he stakes his currency issuing treasury bonds too close to the price of gold, the United States will, first of all, run out of gold, and second of all, foreign nations are going to act like vultures and seize upon it and maybe actually depreciate the value of gold, ending up reducing the amount of money the United States has to actually spend. Lincoln has a second option, right? Well, what if I go to private banks, right? And there are state banks in each of the northern states. There are all sorts of private enterprises to issue credit. What if I go to these banks and I ask for money? Lincoln does that, but then he's met with a sort of grotesque and disgusting answer, right? They said, yes, we'll loan you the credit. And the way that they would do that is by the United States Treasury issuing treasury bonds with an interest rate, which means you print out this piece of paper that says, I owe you this much money, and over time that amount of money is going to increase. But the interest rate they wanted to buy these treasury bonds was astronomical, right? It was 20-30%, which would bankrupt the government pretty quickly and hold it constantly in hock to private financial interests. So Lincoln, right, these people seem like vultures to Lincoln, trying to profit from the problems of the war, the problems of the United States political situation. So he decides to take a more radical strategy. And this is probably, honestly, it's one of the most interesting things in this entire class, and it's something you need to think about for, basically economic policy today. Lincoln decides to issue the greenbacks. And they're called greenbacks because they use green ink to help prevent forgery and also to give it a kind of distinctive look. Lincoln decides to opt for the greenbacks, an idea pioneered by his Secretary of the Treasury, a guy named Salmon Chase. Chase was formerly a member of the Liberty Party. He kind of ran in the same circles as Free Soil Democrats, and he becomes a staunch Republican early on when the party's formed. So Chase comes up with this idea, right? What if the Treasury issues its own currency, and the only thing backing it is the good faith of the United States government? This is known as fiat currency. Fiat from the Latin, which means let it be. So where does this money derive its worth? Because the government says so. So I want to take a sidetrack real quick about monetary theory, right? Some people, even today, and it's a kind of popular common sense idea, is that money is representative, right? So the dollar bill in your pocket is supposed to stand in for something, right? And in this time, and up until Nixon in the 1970s, this stand-in was gold or some kind of precious metal. And so the idea was you'd have this dollar bill, and while it's just a piece of paper, you could, in theory, go to a bank and say, I want this dollar bill in gold, please. And the idea behind that is, look, gold has some intrinsic value. It's worth something automatically. And so, if you back your currency with gold, that means the paper you're issuing, it has to be, it can theoretically hold a level of value to people. Now, the problem with paper money in relation to gold, if you remember from the Jackson documentary, is that state banks, and this is the problem they ran into, they want to fund land speculation. So what they'll do is you issue more paper money than actual gold you have in your vault. And in theory, that's the idea, is that you can generate economic activity. Not every person is going to turn around and take the money that you print out and try to get gold from it. But if you print out too much paper money and you don't have enough gold to actually supply it when these financial ventures crash and people try to cash in the money that the state banks are issuing, then these people are left holding the bag. Their paper is literally worthless, right? Because there's no gold to which it's backed. Additionally, right, there's mutual suspicion among different banks that, well, maybe that note actually isn't going to be worth something because that state bank has a poor credit rating, right? It's been known in the past to default on payments in gold, so they'll value it less. In short, what the greenback ended up doing was revolutionizing. I mean, in theory, it was just in short term, but in later points in the United States history, this idea comes up, right? Why do we need a currency linked to something that somebody could accumulate, right? In theory, somebody could buy up all the gold, right? And then they are the ones who pull all the strings when it comes to issuing credit and creating money, right? What if money is just sort of the activity that the government is trying to pour in to spur kind of economic activities, trade, and so on? So the greenback, right, if you go on and take United States history too, I'm sure there are some professors who are not too bright and don't even talk about greenbacks or talk about the Greenback Party or talk about how this fuels the later movement of populism. But it's this basic idea that the government should be the one, right, as a public authority to issue money and to issue credit. You shouldn't leave that in the hands of banks. You shouldn't leave that in the hands of people who can accumulate special metal, right, gold, silver, etc., in which there's a limited supply, and then even if there is an extended supply, it could be harvested by unsavory means. And that's something that happens today, where in different parts of the world, people are exposed to all sorts of toxic chemicals, paid the equivalent of pennies, and forced to work and destroy the environment to sort of rip up all this metal. The problem is, right, it can fall in the hands of just groups of individuals who can apply this wealth to sort of continue to accumulate more and to exact pressures from public governments. So the idea that eventually gets associated with these greenbacks is that you need public money for a public government. In other words, you need democratic money for a democratic government. So even today, right, this idea is not something that people necessarily think about anymore. The United States currency currently is a fiat currency, so the only thing backing the United States dollar, so when you take the dollar out of your pocket, it literally is its own value. The dollar is worth $1. It's not worth gold. There's nothing behind it. It's worth itself. But unlike the greenback, it's not linked to public authority. Right? The Federal Reserve, which is what prints the money, buys treasury bonds from the United States government to be able to issue to create and issue the money supply. But the Federal Reserve is a private institution. So when maybe you or your family are going to receive your Trump check in the mail, you're going to get $1,200 possibly, or some amount of money. If you're following current news, you would find out, right, the Federal Reserve has been quite open, right? We can print infinite money, right? We can make as much as we want because it doesn't actually reflect some substance or something hidden away in a vault somewhere that it represents. It's supposed to represent economic activity. So it's not a representation, but a mediation. I know that's kind of heady concepts, and maybe this is too much for a History 113 class, but it's something worth thinking about when it comes to economic theory. A lot of economics professors are totally abysmal. They don't know anything, and they depend upon old models that they reprint in textbooks that are basically useless for describing actual reality. They can't predict future events. They barely understand things happening in the past. But anyway, just as an aside, right, the greenbacks is a key development in American history, and it will continue into the 19th, further in the 19th, into the 20th, and maybe one day, hopefully today, make a return in the 21st century. There are advocates for public banking, public money, public credit, but the greenback is a key concept in the development of that idea in American history. All right. Now, besides issuing the greenback, the federal government also raises money by kind of a mass sell-off of federal land. So they're going to sell land on the cheap. Now, part of that is sort of for the common man. A lot of common people are now allowed, the 99% regular people, they now have access to buying cheap farmland to sort of fuel the war effort. And then, of course, it's also interpreted as a patriotic thing to do, right? You're helping your government fight the war. But this also sees the rise of these new tycoons, and we're going to talk about them a little bit more in the next lecture. But the name John D. Rockefeller, right, if you know anything about him, and if you take a U.S. History 2 class, some people will ignore him or not talk too much about him, but that's a key name for understanding basically how the world works even up till today. Rockefeller becomes an oil man, but the way he becomes an oil man is he gets access to cheap land that he buys from the government. And then also you see the rise of railway monopolies, which we'll talk a little bit more next class, who are buying up new land and the federal government's issuing them contracts on the cheap to build massive railroads, particularly the Union Pacific Railroad, which is supposed to connect the East Coast to the West Coast from New York to California. These help propel, in theory, public supply, right? Gives you access to greater goods, traveling at a faster speed. But as we'll talk about next lecture, railroad men kind of exploit this fact and they make a killing. So the Civil War sees the rise of kind of this new group of men who become extraordinarily wealthy. Also, another key element to funding the war was the United States. The North, their key export to the world was wheat and grain. And so European countries particularly started to depend on U.S. grain input. So the United States attached a political price tag to their grain, and through skilled diplomats in places like the United Kingdom, in France, in Italy, the United States would say, look, we'll sell you grain, but you have to stay out of the war. Right? You cannot intervene on behalf of our enemies. And we're going to come back to that. All right, back to the war. So after the failure of Second Bull Run, General Robert E. Lee decides, right, what if I can knock the North out of the war by sort of securing a key victory on their own turf? And so part of the South's strategy, part of Robert E. Lee's strategy is survival, which is a tactic he learned from George Washington, that, hey, all you got to do is live. As long as you got an army in the field, as long as your government still exists, even if it's mobile, your country can still keep fighting. So it seems like you still are a viable option to the vast majority of people. But another key feature of the Southern strategy and the North strategy was an idea pioneered from a French theoretician of war, a guy named Jomini. And the idea was, if you want to win a war, you need a glorious, romantic, decisive battle. You need to just destroy your enemy in absolute victory. And if you can get one of those, then you probably knock your opponent right out of the war. So Jomini is writing from his experience during the Napoleonic Wars, and Napoleon knocked country after country out of the war by decisively drawing them into a large conflict and eviscerating their armies. So Lee's looking for the same thing. So Lee moves up north. The United States Army catches him in a place called Antietam in Maryland, and this is the bloodiest battle of the entire Civil War. There's a total loss of 22,000 soldiers over roughly 3 days. And this is the most bloody battle of the Civil War, but just think of it in comparison to the first Battle of Bull Run. People in the North were shocked that 600 people died. Now you got 22,000. This is crazy. The amount of bodies, the amount of bloodshed, it was just kind of astronomical. The North ends up winning this battle, so Lee has to retreat back into Virginia, but it's a Pyrrhic victory, which is comes from Roman history, where the Romans ended up winning by just throwing more and more men until the victorious army didn't have enough soldiers to keep fighting. So the North won, but they lost more men than the South. They just kind of kept throwing men. It was a complete slaughter, but they had more people, and so Lee couldn't risk it. From this vantage point, Abraham Lincoln makes a key political move, right? Lincoln himself was a kind of nobody moderate Republican. He was a conscience Whig, but part of the reason they ran him for president in 1860 was because nobody really knew who he was. They didn't want to scare off nativists. They didn't want to scare off more conservative, moderate Republicans the way that they did in 56 with Fremont. But Lincoln himself was kind of actively opposed to slavery, right? You can clearly see that in his debate with Stephen Douglas. But Republicans were kind of on the fence about what to do with slavery. But Lincoln sort of takes the advantage, and he issues, as executive, as the head of the army, he issues the Emancipation Proclamation. He uses the victory to sort of propel the war into becoming more about anti-slavery, but the Emancipation Proclamation has its limits. In it, Lincoln says, slavery in all of the rebel states is now abolished. However, Lincoln does not abolish slavery in the border states, places like Kentucky, places like Maryland and Delaware. All right, they keep slaves there because they don't want to alienate any more states fleeing to the South. But, right, from some critics, from some historians, they say, well, that kind of proves Lincoln's really not, his heart's not in it, right? This war isn't really about slavery. And that's true. Up until this point, right, and we're going to come back to that, the war isn't directly about slavery. It's about the Union. It's about reining in rebels from destroying, in theory, the nation. But the Emancipation Proclamation is the furthest step by a United States president up to this point, or even a United States government official, really in ending slavery. Now, Lincoln's effort is not radical when you take a kind of global perspective. Most countries, when they're at war with someone, begin freeing either their own slaves or their enemies' slaves as potential soldiers in the conflict, right? If the South can be spun into chaos, as Lincoln and his cabinet think it will, right? If it can be spun into chaos because slaves now here, right? You're free. The United States has freed you, right? If you leave the plantation and make it to a Union army or make it to a northern state, right? You're guaranteed, at least not citizenship necessarily, but you're not property anymore. So hopefully this will spur a great exodus of slaves kind of escaping from their masters and kind of ruining further the South's cotton economy. But again, right, this is the furthest step a United States government official has taken up to this point. Additionally, in sort of this era, right, during 62, 63, Lincoln really cracks down on border states that are kind of flirting with secession. And the key place in this is Maryland. And for obvious reasons, right? Maryland is right over top of Washington, D.C. Part of the territory of Maryland was used to make up Washington, D.C. Maryland was a slave state, but it never kind of went all the way. But there were lots of sympathizers in Maryland for the Confederacy. So I'm from actually a place called Rockville, Maryland, which is pretty close to Washington, D.C. And when I would walk to school, there was a house I'd always pass by called the Prettyman House. And the Prettyman House was where at least a number of Confederate sympathizers would meet to conspire to try to come up with some way of trying to get Maryland to move into the southern orbit. But Lincoln was ruthless, right? Lincoln suspended the right of habeas corpus, which means if you get arrested, habeas corpus means you have the body. So the idea is if I get arrested, I can ask the government, hey, what evidence do you have against me? Right? And the government is legally obligated to show you in a public trial. But without habeas corpus, which is an old English kind of civil liberty that translated to North America, without habeas corpus, someone could arrest me and say, okay, well, what evidence do you have against me, for this crime, right? You say you're a traitor, you're committing treason, you're attacking the government, you're seditious, you're a rebel. And I say, okay, well, what proof do you have? They don't have to show anything. They just say, it's my word against yours, and I'm the government, so suck it, right? So without habeas corpus, a lot of civil liberties in the justice system go out their window. But of course, the key part about this is keep Maryland in the Union no matter what. So without, it kind of functions like a police state. And for Southern apologists to this day, right, Lincoln is a tyrant. He's basically a kind of totalitarian. But war efforts usually demand extraordinary means. And pretty much any country in a state of war starts to curtail some of its civil liberties, which is a pretty strong argument why countries should not be in a state of war, especially if it's an unlimited, endless war and it's unwinnable. But wars tend to erode civil liberties, and so Lincoln kind of took the initiative to keep Maryland, by force if necessary, by brutality if necessary, in the United States. All right, so real quick, what were the different political options in the mainstream for the United States during the Civil War? Well, one option was kind of associated generally with more conservative or moderate Republicans, and they basically thought, look, the war is to force the South back, right? They have to come back. There's no negotiating with them on that point, but how are they going to come back? Some more conservative Republicans were fine if the South kept its slaves, right? As long as the slave question was settled in terms of further expansion of slavery to the West or slavery expanding to the North. But the South can keep its slaves if they decide to, get rid of their leaders, say they're sorry, come back to the United States. Of course, there were also more radical Republicans, and we're going to talk a lot more about them next lecture. But radical Republicans began very early on linking the war effort to the slave issue, right? Yes, the South can come back to the United States. Yes, we're going to force them back, right, if necessary. But they have to, under no circumstance are they allowed to keep their slaves. They have to abolish slavery. And then, of course, right, even though, right, that represents the Republican Party and the Republican Party was the dominant force in the North, there were still Northern Democrats. And the Democratic Party in the North had basically adopted an anti-war position. They were known as copperheads because copperheads are a very poisonous snake, and snakes are sneaky and evil and deceptive. So this was a name, obviously, they didn't give themselves, but Republicans gave them. And so they accused the Democrats of basically stabbing the North in the back, right? The North is trying to wage the war, and they're undermining public morale by criticizing it. The Democratic Party basically advocated for peace under any circumstances, but they were okay with the United States being permanently fractured. This party's interests basically represented the last opinions of Stephen Douglas, but Stephen Douglas, who had run against Lincoln in 1860, right? He was a hard-drinking, hard-working man, and he basically killed himself by alcoholism and hyper amounts of stress, and he died very kind of early in his political career. So he's out of the picture, but the Democratic Party basically reflects his ethos. All right, so real quick, foreign interests involved in the Civil War, right? In Britain, under the Tory government of Lord Palmerston, the United Kingdom treads neutrality. The United Kingdom, right, it's buying up huge amounts of southern cotton, but it's not willing to back the South. Now, there are several reasons for this. One is because the price tag the United States had attached to its grain shipments. So the UK depended upon grain to feed its industrial worker population. And so if the UK broke off a formal ties with the United States, if it joined with the Confederacy, it would lose northern grain in exchange for southern cotton. So, and on top of that, the British population was generally against the idea of helping a slave nation versus a free nation. This seems severely hypocritical considering it was the UK government in 1807 that first abolished the slave trade. So Palmerston and his Tory government decided, in its free trade Tory government, decided to chart a kind of very tenuous neutral line. Officially, they said, right, we're not recognizing the Confederacy, but we're also not denouncing it. But on the side, wealthy elites linked to several figures in government helped supply the South with loans and particularly with ships. The South, at one point, by halfway through the war, the South's Navy was all being manufactured in Great Britain, right? the South didn't lack generally, outside of Richmond, the kind of industrial output to build steamships, but it wasn't enough to overcome the North. Additionally, France, who was being led by the Emperor Napoleon III, who generally worked hand in glove with the British at this point, he too secretly backed the Confederacy while officially saying, look, right, we're not taking a position, we're not recognizing the Confederate government. However, secretly Napoleon III had some key French financiers issue loans to the Confederate government so it could keep going in a bid to sort of see if the South wins the war and kind of continues to exist as an independent nation, it might be able to help France engage itself in an attempted conquest of Mexico, which you might think is crazy, but our holiday, which is not really that popular in Mexico as much as it is in the United States, but Cinco de Mayo is linked to a French invasion of Mexico where the Mexicans won a key battle and they honored it on the 5th of May, which the United States decides to honor by binging in tequila and eating tortilla chips. But France wants to sort of carve out Mexico again, right? They had failed in the 1830s and 40s, and they want to try again. So they're hoping the South will back them. But wait, right? Isn't the UK government, especially in France to a lesser extent, isn't it dependent on southern cotton, right? How could they just forego their key export textiles, right, for, just wheat for food, right? That seems crazy. Couldn't you grow food somewhere else? Well, the problem is, there was an agricultural boom from 1859 to 1861 where the South had, an exorbitant amount of cotton, and they sold so much cotton to Great Britain in those three years, 59, 60, and 61, that Britain and France had storehouses and storehouses full of raw cotton. So because they had all these storehouses of extra cotton, they didn't need to keep trading with the South, at least not immediately. So that allowed both the UK and France time sort of to ride the fence to see if the South can actually turn the war and seem like a viable option. But it also allowed Britain to sort of start searching out for new places to grow cotton. And Britain ultimately starts to shift to Egypt and to India for its raw cotton production. But that's sort of beyond the scope of this class. All right, so back to the main war, right? 1863 turns out to be one of the most decisive years for the Union, right? 1863 is the turning point where a formerly stalemated conflict between North and South starts to actually turn into the Union's favor. So first, right, there's the Battle of Chancellorsville. This is another Union loss. However, the key element to this battle, it's worth noting, is that the South loses its best general, a guy named Stonewall Jackson, who worked under the command of Robert E. Lee, but he was probably superior in terms of tactic and military ability. Ironically, maybe Stonewall Jackson wasn't actually killed in the battle. He wasn't even killed by the United States, but he was accidentally shot by his own men who thought he was a scout for the Union who was riding to sort of check out their camp early in the morning when it was still kind of dark and hazy in the woods. But after Chancellorsville, after a string of other battles in Virginia, Lee tries to secure that final cataclysmic battle in a counterattack, and he moves to the north and gets kind of cornered by the Union Army under George Meade in a sleepy Pennsylvania town called Gettysburg. This is also one of the most bloody battles of the entire war, not as bloody as Antietam, but very close. And from this vantage, Lincoln uses the war to offer an impromptu speech which becomes super famous, the Gettysburg Address, which kind of focuses the war effort and the sort of ideas behind it to focus on something. It's not just about winning the battle. It's not just about political conquest. It's not even just about the government or the sustainability of the Union. He starts to kind of cast a vision, right? This Union, which must be inseparable, which the revolutionary generation kind of helped forge, this Union has global dimensions, right? The United States' cause is the cause of liberty everywhere, right? It's a global phenomenon, right? It's a project that has divine fingerprints all over it. This is a super ideological speech, but Lincoln is linking the war effort, right? It's not just about the Union, it's not just a political entity, but it's about freedom. And this war is about redefining the notion of freedom for all Americans, white, black, whatever. Right? You can take that or leave it. Maybe it's just propaganda. Maybe it was just something, a kind of crazy idea Lincoln had. But it becomes known in retrospect as this key hallmark for understanding the Civil War. Additionally, this guy here, right, he'll become famous very soon after this. But he's a guy named Ulysses S. Grant. He was a key United States general, but he had been posted in the West. Under Grant's leadership, he kind of grinds his way through and finally kind of corners the Southern Army out west at the Battle of Vicksburg, or this campaign that climaxes in Vicksburg, and he finally gets complete control over the Mississippi River. So, right, the Anaconda Plan is sort of choking the South's economy, and then with Grant's army, they finally sliced off the western part of the South and kind of quickly mopped up Confederate forces in places like Texas. All right, so besides that, I just want to go through a couple of kind of interesting alliances that are somewhat significant for the war. First is, right, and you probably never even heard about this even if you're a Civil War buff, but a key ally for the United States is Russia, right? Russia, right? Who would have thought? Right? Far away, but what does Russia have to do with this? Well, at the time, Russia was being ruled by a more liberal, what we could call liberal emperor, and I mean liberal in the sense of he was engaged in efforts for freedom. So this emperor Tsar Alexander, he actually abolishes serfdom, which is somewhat comparable to slavery, though it's a little bit different. It's less extreme, but it's on the spectrum where people were held to the land or to particular households and they couldn't leave whenever they want. So Alexander II abolishes serfdom. But more importantly, Tsar Alexander and Russia in general, the Russian government, want to really put a knife in the side of France and Great Britain. During the 1850s, Russia lost a significant battle against Turkey, which Great Britain and France backed, called the Crimean War. And so Russia does not want to see British and French empire or dreams of empire kind of extend to North America. So Tsar Alexander sends his fleet, he has a navy, they send the Russian fleet and it makes a stop in New York and it makes a stop in San Francisco. And this is kind of a quaint thing. People are like, oh, who are these strange people, right? Showing Union support. Newspapers in New York and San Francisco kind of note this happening. But the point of Russia doing this is to signal to Great Britain and to France that if you decide to opt for the Confederacy, if you actually come out strong for the South, Russia will declare war on you and it will declare war on behalf of the United States. So with the South quickly losing, right, in a place like Gettysburg and Antietam, right, not able to make that decisive counterattack, with the South slowly being strangled, with the Cotton Glut allowing France and Britain to sort of seek out other options, right? This is just further piling on the fact that the UK and France really have no good reason to end up backing the Confederacy, and their best bet is just to stay out of it and kind of hope the South can cobble together something, right? Better to do that than risk either world war or cutting off Union grain shipments. Another interesting fact is that the Native American nation of the Cherokee backed the Confederacy. Now, why would they do this? Well, one, the Cherokee had a long history of frustrating relations with the United States. Remember, it was Andrew Jackson and an ineffective, emasculated Supreme Court that did nothing to prevent them being shipped out of Georgia and moved to the North Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas region, right? So Cherokee have no love for the United States, and on top of it, right, even though the Confederacy enshrined slavery as one of their key legal rights, it actually gave a lot of political representation to Native Americans. So Cherokee were actually, the Cherokee that lived in the Confederacy, they were actually allowed to send their own delegates to the Confederate Congress representing the nations that they were a part of. So and on top of that, The Cherokee and a lot of some of these larger, quote unquote, more civilized Indian nations, they had adopted basically Southern ways of life. Cherokee owned slaves. Some Cherokee ran giant plantations, like people, affiliated with the Southern oligarchy of the Cotton Kingdom. So the Cherokee and Southern way of life wasn't that different. The South, under the Confederacy, respected Cherokee rights. And on top of it, the United States didn't seem interested in doing anything more. So the Cherokee actually backed the Confederacy. Another element was another key element kind of up for political diplomacy was the Vatican, right? What does the Pope have to do with this? Well, there were a lot of Irish throughout the United States. There were a lot of Irish who had come to the north, and so the key post in the Catholic Church in the United States was the Archbishop of New York. And then there were some Irish who were moving to the south, though not nearly in the same number. And the key position in the south was the Archbishopric of New Orleans. Now, of course, as you might expect, the Archbishop of New York supported the Union efforts in the war on the north side. The Archbishop of New Orleans supported the Southern war cause. And the Confederacy wanted to win a moral victory by seeing if they could get the Pope on the south side. The Pope at the time, Leo XIII, was very critical of the kinds of social movements that were happening in the North. It was critical of industrialization. It was critical of the way workers were being treated as wage slaves. And he'll eventually kind of enshrine this in a papal encyclical called Rerum Novarum. But at this time, Leo XIII seems a little undecided, so the Confederates actually send diplomats to try to get the Vatican on the south side, right? We're not like the North, right? We embrace a kind of pure, simple, more romantically ancient way of life, right? Something that's more maybe affable to the Roman Catholic Church. So, right, you should back us. But the Pope chooses to do nothing, but it's just sort of an interesting side where, you don't necessarily imagine, but American diplomats are running around Rome, running around Italy, trying to convince the Pope to join one side of the war effort or the other. But Confederate diplomats were in the Vatican and were trying to push the Pope to siding with them. So we've been approaching this so far sort of a bird's eye, eagle's eye perspective, talking about casualty numbers, war strategies, generals. But in this section, I want to cover real quickly the real people who suffered the brunt of the warfare, the real people who were being slaughtered and massacred in droves by bayonet, cannon fire, and rifles, right? Talking about the average soldiery. And so, if you're a Civil War enthusiast, there's lots of books or reenactments that engage in the real nitty-gritty details, but I'm just going to give a kind of overview in a short fashion to kind of give you a sense of what life was like. First of all, as you can note from this soldier's face, this kid is probably younger than you, right? People who are 16, 17, they were signing up for the war, right? You didn't have to be a full-grown adult to serve. In the case of many Irish, if you ever watch the movie Gangs in New York, there's a great scene where the Irish, they're stepping off the boat. They're saying, "Congratulations, welcome to the United States. You're now a citizen, and you're now a private in the Union Army. Get back on this other boat, and you're going to go be shipped off to, God knows where," right? And so there's a kind of interesting juxtaposition in the movie where they show the living young adolescent soldiers kind of stepping onto the boat while coffins are being removed. So, these kids are suffering immense casualties. They're the real fodder for the war effort. All right. In general, right, a key thing that you might think about considering this virus season we're in is medicine, right? Like today, right, people are panicked because there's no vaccine for the coronavirus. What are we going to do? Right, there's all sorts of efforts to try to figure it out. If you listen to all these medical professionals, hopefully you're not listening too much because it's a little manic. But you have all these different opinions. People aren't really sure what works. There's actual epistemic peer disagreement where two people are doctors, they're both experts, and they both aren't really sure about what the best strategy forward is, right? Well, medicine has made huge advances in terms of technology and knowledge and capacity. But during the Civil War, it made kind of giant exponential growths because of the gruesome injuries, and all sorts of disgusting things that happen in warfare, right? Medicine, to be really frank, was complete shit up to the point of Civil War, right? Germ theory wasn't really kind of understood at this point, right? The idea that there are microbiotic organisms that exist and will make you sick, right? People didn't really know about that or think about that. It was just being pioneered by Louis Pasteur in France. But in general medical knowledge terms, right, this was sort of suspected, but lots of people didn't, give it any real scientific explanation. So if Billy got shot on the battlefield, but he had a perfectly good bandage kind of wrapped around his waist from some earlier gunshot wound, they would harvest that bandage off of Billy's body and put it on Sam. You think, okay, well, bandage is a bandage, right? Or you're going to operate on someone, so you get your tools out, you take your knife, you kind of cut into people and do all that, and then after you're done cutting, then you wash it, right? This is the complete opposite of sanitation, right? And it ends up getting people sick and killed. But during the war effort, there was a big increase in knowledge, right? People starting to figure out, oh, you got to sanitize the equipment, right? Even though they didn't know how it worked, people were starting to pick up on these facts just because, if once you operate on someone, 20 different people and they die from the same surgery that's supposed to save them, and then all of a sudden you wash your instrument and say bleach, and they didn't die, they didn't get an infection, you start putting the pieces together. And besides the actual casualties in the war, another big killer besides the actual conflict was disease. Some of this disease was because of close encampment, right? So again, they don't understand germ theory. So if somebody's pissing it up river or, whatever, just kind of throwing contaminants into your water supply, and then you drink it, you could get violently ill, right? Another key death dealer during war, particularly during the Civil War, were STDs, right? Soldiers are on the move, they're young men, and women make their services available, both being exploited and trying to survive during this really rough time. So camp women ended up spreading all sorts of venereal diseases, but doctors start learning how do they spread, how do they work, and trying to track these patterns. But doctors are trying to prevent deaths due to gonorrhea and a variety of other horrible things. But all in all, right, medical technology begins to improve. Medicine is the front line for women who want to get involved in the war, right? So there aren't women in the army, but many women volunteer for all sorts of nursing brigades. And medical technology is rapidly expanded because of their experiences, figuring out how to treat the wounded, how to treat and save the dying, how to kind of formulate hospitals to prevent contamination from one patient to another, how to treat wounds without causing infections, all sorts of things. All sorts of new surgeries are being pioneered to try to save lives, even if it involves cutting off limbs, cutting out eyeballs, cutting out bones, right? All sorts of horrible procedures, but it saves lives, and doctors are learning rapidly as new cases are brought to them. Another key element of the soldiery, so besides a lot of Irish soldiers perishing in the fighting, a lot of Americans dying, freed slaves, right, either from their own generation or from past generations who are free blacks living in the North, they're allowed to volunteer in the military, right? After the Emancipation Proclamation, the United States Army actively begins recruiting freed slaves or free blacks to join the army and to fight. Now, a vast majority of these black soldiers, right, they don't actually get to engage in combat, right? They get kind of the grunt work, digging latrines, building camps, building fortifications. Not the glamorous stuff. I mean, if you could think any of it's glamorous, it's pretty horrible all around. But if there are the glamour parts, right, you usually think it's the guy fighting, right? He's the real hero, right? That's kind of bullshit. But the black soldiers in a few regiments got to actively participate in the fighting. And for them, right, this was them actively fighting in the cause of freedom, right? They weren't just passive. They weren't just waiting for someone to save them. They were actively trying to resist their oppressor and free their fellow countrymen from a system of inhumane bondage, right? And so a key group was the 54th Regiment of Massachusetts, which was a black unit. It was led by white officers. Particularly in that case, it was a colonel by the name of Robert Gould Shaw. In the 1990s, they made a movie about this unit called Glory, where Matthew Broderick, who was from Ferris Bueller's Day Off, if you know that movie, uh, he he plays Robert Shaw, and it's about how this unit kind of builds its cohesiveness and then ultimately dies in this failed attempt to take a southern fort, but they become romanticized as not only proof that black men are truly human beings, they're capable of fighting, they have great emotional investment in the cause of freedom, but they can too also die nobly alongside a white man, right? And so the final scene of that movie, spoiler alerts, right? They all die, or a good chunk of them die. But in the final scene, you see a mass grave being dug with both black and white soldiers buried together, right? There's common humanity. And the war sort of allows freed blacks and freed slaves to express that and demonstrate that. And like I mentioned, right, the Irish become a huge uh, component to the North's war machine. And for generals like Ulysses Grant, right, he factors them in this really brutal war calculus, right? We've got 22 million people in the North. We have a larger army. We can just grind them down, right? For every Southern soldier we kill, we can lose a Union soldier, and we will still win. So this becomes part of Grant's calculus as he becomes a key figure in the North's war effort. And so this is just a quick picture, right? The South was terrified at the idea of black soldiers fighting against them, so they put special bounties to capture members of the 54th Regiment and other uh, soldiering black units in the United States Army. Now, another key development in the United States strategy was sort of ramping up the war effort. So the United States tends to think, okay, what if we can kind of break off other key parts of the South and isolate Virginia, right? Pushing straight down doesn't work. So the United States decides to land an army of United States soldiers in the port of Savannah, which had been under control by the U.S. Navy, and they were going to send that army and march it up to Atlanta, which was another key industrial center in the South, right? It wasn't nearly as big as Richmond. It wasn't that important. But Atlanta, right, if you can punch them where it hurts and kind of ruin their industry, maybe you'll just knock the South out of the war. Now, this United States Army that is doing this naval invasion is under the command of a guy named William Sherman, which is also where the name of the Sherman tank comes from. William T. Sherman is not like many of the other generals in the Civil War. Most of the other generals in the Civil War really like warfare. They look at it as a complicated chess game, right? How do you out-strategize your opponent? Robert E. Lee is once reputed to have said something to the effect of, right, if war wasn't so terrible, right, I'm glad God made war so terrible because that's the only thing I'd want to do. I love it. Right? The strategy, the wit of one general against another, trying to beat them in combat, outmaneuvering them, right? It's a lot of fun to tacticians, right? But Sherman was very different. He hated war. He's famous for saying, right, war's hell. And so, because war is terrible, Sherman didn't look at this as, oh, this is fun, right? No, this is terrible. This is awful, right? You have to end this as soon as humanly possible. But for someone like Sherman, the only way to end wars quick was by being brutal, unrelenting, ruthless, merciless, and devastating. So Sherman wants to apply this logic, and this is the idea of total war, right? There isn't, in most conventional wars, you think, okay, well, there's a battlefield where the fighting happens, and then there's the home front where civilians live. There are soldiers, armed combatants, right? Those are the people participating in the fight, and then there are civilians. It's wrong if you confuse them. All right, so soldiers shouldn't shoot at civilians. Soldiers shouldn't conduct battles in undesignated areas. Right? People are supposed to have a sense of where the peace is and where the war is. Sherman says that's total nonsense, right? This is just prolonging the inevitable. It's prolonging the horrible calculus of warfare. And you know what? If you want to back a rebel group, if you want to prolong this warfare, then you should suffer the consequences. It's not just the soldiers who should suffer, it's the civilians. So when Sherman makes his march up to Georgia, or up through Georgia, up to Atlanta, he's ruthless with all civilian property, right? If he sees a plantation house, he marches in there, and says, get the hell out, right? This is now United States property. Your slaves all belong to the United States Army. They're all free, right? And all of the food you have, all of your medical supplies, all of your cotton, right, now it belongs to us. And of course, what does Sherman do with the cotton? He burns it. He burns houses, he burns fields, he burns any sense of economic interest that the South might have. He rips up railroads, right? All of this is to really punch the South, right? If you want to keep fighting this war, you're going to know how to suffer. You're going to bleed. So Sherman is pretty ruthless. He'll continue his career after the Civil War and being a kind of completely bloodthirsty Indian killer. But part of this is kind of proving the logic of the war, right? It has to end. It needs to end now. War is not pleasant. On top of this, right, besides being maybe a killer and a kind of take no prisoner maniac, Sherman is very clear about what the war effort requires for long-term freedom for the slave, right? So Sherman begins to experiment on the Sea Islands of South Carolina, but then he issues this executive Army Order 15, where he starts requisitioning land from these large plantations and says, okay, now you slaves, you're all free, and your former master's land, I'm chopping it up and it all belongs to you, right? And of course the plantation owners say, how can you do that? This is my land, this is my house, this is my property, how can you take my property? That's unjust. He says, look, you fucked up, you're a traitor, you betrayed the United States, and so that's the price you pay, right? You lose everything. Now you're poor. Congratulations. You have nothing. So Sherman begins experimenting, right? If we take the land from particularly the wealthy elite in the South, we could just give it to the slaves. And so that is a way to kind of invite them in economically and to participate in what will be the aftermath of the war. But Sherman doesn't have this kind of grand vision. He is just mainly about punishing the South. All right, finally, we're kind of reaching the end, right? So Grant, now that the West is knocked out, now that Sherman has screwed up the South, the lower South, Grant sees it's time, right? Now we can deliver the death blow, right? We can grind our way to Richmond. And so Grant steadily pushes his way into Virginia. He can't quite just attack Richmond head on because it would, go into a long-term siege. And as long as Richmond has railroads, as long as it has supply chains, it could survive for a while. So Grant decides to methodically, one by one, try to chop off all these supply chains. Of course, Robert E. Lee can't let that happen because if that happens, the Confederate government goes. The capital is open to United States invasion. So Lee keeps trying to engage Grant while he's attacking. Eventually, Lee gets cornered and he's captured, and he ultimately surrenders the South's largest and final army at the Appomattox Courthouse. So there, basically, Lee gives up his army. The government is in kind of disarray. The South can't really fight anymore, doesn't have any more people to fight. We haven't really looked too much at what's happening in the South during all this, but during this time, there are a lot of Southerners who are fed up with the Confederate government. They don't like that it's intruding into their lives, requisitioning their property, putting them in bread lines, forcing them to serve in an army that they don't want to participate in. So there's increasing numbers of deserters running away from Confederate armies. Even some of the states like North Carolina and Georgia start to revolt from Confederate war directives. So they say, look, our soldiers don't belong to you. They belong to the states. So we're not going to send them off to the Confederacy. We're going to do our own thing. Now, after this, the South is kind of obliterated and now is sort of placed under direct military control. So here's a famous picture of what happens at Appomattox. Very gentlemanly. Lee surrenders his sword and says, oh, good day, chap, right? And he's surrendered. He's no longer the head of the Confederate Army. And now Grant is in total control of Virginia. Now, even up to this point, right, Jefferson Davis is like, well, there are still people fighting. There are guerrillas. There are people still committed to the Confederate cause. What if I run away? What if I'll just kind of be a mobile government and I'll just kind of preach from place to place, right? Keep fighting, resist, fight to the very end, right? Until every single Southerner is bled to death. Until the entire economy is destroyed. Until every Southerner is sort of forced by gunpoint to give up. Of course, this isn't very popular, and people will just get out of here, Jefferson Davis. We're done with you. So the South surrenders. But, right, some people can't really live with the war being over, and so in the case of this guy Edmund Ruffin, Ruffin was an old man when the Civil War began. He was an arch secessionist from the very beginning. He was one of these Southern nationalists that was connected to people like George Fitzhugh. Ruffin volunteered at, I believe he was in his 50s or 60s. He volunteered for the South Carolina Charleston militia, and he's actually the first person to have fired on Fort Sumter, right, with this militia group. Now, Edmund Ruffin, he's nobody. He doesn't really do anything during the war. He's just a regular person. But he's interesting because he is the kind of one of the first people to participate in this war. And when the war comes to an end, Ruffin cannot live without the South, right? If the South goes, so does freedom, and so does Ruffin. So Ruffin, when he hears the news that the South had surrendered, that South Carolina was now going back into the Union under a military government, Ruffin, he has some friends over, he chats with them. He goes up into his bedroom and he blows his brains out with a gun, right? And for some Southerners, right, once the cause is dead, once secession is over, once the dream of the Cotton Kingdom is finally expired, right, they have no more reason to go on living. Now, next lecture we're going to talk about, right, one more lecture, we're almost there. Next lecture we're going to go on to talk about the aftermath and how this actually plays out for the United States, and hopefully it will help set you up for any further United States history classes you take. But it will kind of cash out while, yes, the Civil War ends slavery, the results of slavery or the functional depredations of slavery will continue. Until then, keep thriving in Corona land. Keep hanging in there. I'll talk to you soon.